Welcome to the History of Retina's Leaders and Legends series. The purpose of these interviews is to capture first-hand stories from individuals with unique retinal insight of historical significance. Through these discussions, we hope to provide a fuller understanding of the evolution of both the science and practice of retina through the lens of those individuals who have actually lived it. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to be joined by Dr. Lee Jampol, the Louis Feinberg, MD, Professor of Ophthalmology at Northwestern University. After graduating from Yale University School of Medicine with cum laude honors and an induction into Alpha Omega Alpha Medical Honor Society, Dr. Jampol completed his ophthalmology residency at Yale and a fellowship in retinal vascular disease at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Dr. Jampol's remarkable career has largely centered around research trials, studying retinal diseases like diabetic retinopathy and central serous retinopathy. He has been a key player in some of our field's most pivotal trials, such as the Macular Photocoagulation Study, SCORE studies, and Submacular Surgery Trials. He has also been extremely involved with the DRCR Retina Network since its inception over 2 decades ago, and served as a former chair of this collaborative research network. A revered educator, surgeon, and clinician, Dr. Jampol has also held many leadership roles, including serving as president of AOS and trustee and VP of ARVO. For his many contributions, he has received numerous awards, including the Gas Medal from Macula and Retina Societies, Lifetime Achievement Award from AAO, and the Crystal Apple Award from ASRS. Dr. Jampol continues to be a very active member of our retina community and a highly sought-after lecturer, and I am just delighted to welcome Dr. Lee Jampol, who has kindly agreed to join us today to share insights on his professional journey as the field of retina came of age. Welcome to ASRS Leaders and Legends. We are so delighted to have you today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited about this.
You've had a phenomenally rich career thus far, and we can't wait to hear more details about your story. Let's start at the very beginning, though. You grew up in New York. Tell us a little bit about your childhood. What was the young Lee Jampol like?
So we grew up in Queens, New York, and I was very athletic. I was a good student. I admired my father, and a lot of the time I spent working with my father.
And your father was a physician.
He was a cardiologist. At the beginning, he made house calls, and I would drive with him to the house. Sometimes I went in and saw patients with him. Sometimes I waited in the car. But I had a good chance to see him in action, and that was important to me.
And that inspired your initial interest in medicine, is that correct?
Yeah, so my dad was chief of medicine at a hospital in Queens, but he was on the faculty at Cornell, and he used to take me to grand rounds in Manhattan at Cornell. And I would go in there, and they would have these horrendous cases with blood and guts, and it really got me sick to my stomach. But I stuck it out, and I still had interest in medicine after that.
Well, interestingly, you ended up choosing a fairly bloodless specialty, right, in ophthalmology later on.
Yeah, that's no coincidence.
So after high school, you spent a number of years in New Haven at Yale for your education and training. What were your college years like?
Okay, so I actually spent 14 years at Yale, which is a lot longer than most people. College was tremendously interesting. I went to a high school where there were 1,000 people, and I was at the top of that class. And when I got to Yale, I actually found that the people there were not quite as smart as the people at the top of my high school class. And Yale was not as much of a challenge to me academically as I had expected. But I love Yale is a beautiful place, and I love the tradition and the buildings, and so I had good years there.
You were a biology major, I remember you telling me, Lee. Was that part of this stepping stone on your pre-med track, on your way to medicine, or did you commit yourself to medicine a little bit later during those years?
So I think I was pre-med from the beginning because of my dad, but I really love biology, and particularly marine biology. And for a long time, I thought that I was going to be a marine biologist, maybe in Hawaii with the sharks and things of that sort.
And I remember you had told me one of your mentors wasn't too happy when you decided that you were going to veer a little bit and actually end up committing to medicine. Is that right?
So they didn't send me, but they gave me a chance to go to marine biologic lab at Woods Hole, and I spent the summer there. And I was supposed to be working, but I actually spent most of the summer eating lobster and doing other things. So when I got back to New Haven, the person in charge of the biology honors program said, "We're really disappointed in your performance at Woods Hole." He said, "You're going to do a thesis this year. You better win the award as the best thesis." And so I went ahead and I did win that award as the best biology thesis that year. But I was starting to think about medical school at that time. And I remember going in to talk to him and telling him that I was going to go to medical school. And he looked me in the eye and he said, "If you do that, you won't do anything worthwhile in your career." So,
Boy, was he wrong with that prediction. So you ended up staying at Yale for medical school, like you mentioned. You were inducted into the Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Society. Tell me about your time in medical school and how you narrowed your choice down to ophthalmology.
well, my mentor in medical school was someone who worked on sodium transport, which is what I worked in college. And he was a nephrologist. He became very famous. He was the chief of medicine at Beth Israel in Boston. So he was my mentor, and I was going to be a nephrologist. And then in the third year, we had to take a rotation. We had a choice of taking a rotation in ophthalmology. And I went into the room and watched the residents examine the patient. And within 10 minutes, I knew that's what I wanted to do. So that changed my life. And then when I went to tell the nephrologist that I was going to go into ophthalmology, he was disappointed also.
You disappointed a lot of your mentors along the way, but it's the most sincere form of flattery that they wanted you in their specialty. So, but you ended up choosing ophthalmology. So our gain, you ended up staying at Yale for your internship and then completed your ophthalmology residency there as well. How were those years, Lee? And after residency, you ended up pursuing a fellowship in retinal vascular disease. How did you grow your interest in that subspecialty in that direction?
So the chief of ophthalmology at Yale was Marvin Sears, and he was a Wilmer resident originally. And in all my travels in ophthalmology, he combined better than anyone else surgical ability, basic science research ability, clinical ability. He wasn't a great teacher, forgive me, Marvin, but he was great at everything else, and he was a tremendous role model for me. And the department at Yale in those days was superb. It was a real honor to work with the faculty there. So I had a great experience in residency, and I was actually on the faculty there for a year, waiting for my fellowship to start.
And I believe one key mentor that you met during your time there too was Mort Goldberg, who came to visit and deliver a lecture there. Tell me about that and how he inspired you.
Yeah, so originally I was going to be a nephrologist, and I loved internal medicine. And I thought in ophthalmology I could look at this manifestations in the eye of those same diseases that I was interested in, lupus and all the other unusual diseases. So Mort Goldberg came as visiting professor. He had actually been at Yale for a period of time during his residency, being chief resident at Yale. So he came to visit as visiting professor, and he gave these great lectures on sickle cell and other things. And again, immediately I knew that's where I wanted to do my fellowship.
And so you did. You went on to do a retinal vascular disease fellowship at the University of Illinois, Chicago. How did you enjoy that time? And did you have other mentors who guided your next steps aside from Dr. Goldberg?
Yeah, so again, at the University of Illinois in those days, there was an incredible faculty with Jerry Fishman and Golden Payman, and in retina, many, many terrific people. So I was really stimulated, and I worked with those people. Um, I realized that, again, I was doing exactly what I wanted to do.
That's excellent.
And Mort was a tremendous mentor to me at that time, but even up to the present time. He's still active, stimulates me, and he asks me questions and reads the literature, and he's a great role model.
He is, and I completely agree. I trained at Wilmer, and he is on faculty there, and just was a total inspiration for me as well. A truly brilliant man. Tell us about your journey post-training, Lee. So you went out to Maryland for a while. Tell us what that was
Not
for and what you
completely
did.
voluntarily.
Yeah.
So in those days, we had the Vietnam War, and almost all doctors had to go into the service. And there was something called the Berry Plan, where for 2 years that they would defer you, but when you finished your training, you had to go in the Army for 2 years. So that was me. And actually, the Army had told me that if I stayed in academics, they wouldn't call me to active duty. I was on reserves. But about May of my fellowship, I got a letter calling me to active duty. And so I moved to Maryland, and I was at Fort Meade, Maryland, and I was also at Walter Reed Army Hospital 1 day a week. And I also arranged to work up at Wilmer 1 day a week. So I had a very interesting schedule. I lived in Columbia, Maryland. I commuted to Baltimore and to Washington.
You also got to meet some giants at that time during your visits at Wilmer with Arnold Patz. Is that right?
Yeah, so Arnold was there and Stuart Fine was there, and I got to know all the important people in my field. That was a real fortuitous thing for me.
Following your time at Maryland, you joined the faculty at Illinois Eye and Ear, and you were quickly promoted to full professor. How did you decide to make that move back to Chicago?
I had three major choices. I was offered a position at the University of Pittsburgh and one other place, and I thought about it a lot. Um, but I had done such good work at Illinois, and I respected the people so much there that I decided to go back to Illinois.
And at some point, I remember you were contemplating a potential position out in Los Angeles. Is that correct?
Yeah, so after a number of years, I was vice chair of the department, and I was getting a little bit bored and looking for new challenges, and I decided it was time to move on. So Brad Stratzma in Los Angeles was recruiting me for Jules Stein, and I almost went there, but at that exact moment, the chair at Northwestern came open, and I decided that I wanted to stay in Chicago, raise my kids in Chicago. So I went over to Northwestern on the other side of town, and I maintained my position, my faculty position at Illinois, and we did a lot of collaborative studies.
That's really wonderful. And you're currently at Northwestern, the Louis Feinberg, MD, professor of ophthalmology. I remember you telling me you were the second full-time faculty there. Is that correct?
That's
And
right.
now there's just there's just dozens of full-time faculty. Tell us a little bit about how you've witnessed the department grow over
Well,
these
so when I took
decades.
over, I had 6 examining lanes in the department. Okay, now we have 80.
Wow.
Now, a lot of that growth was in my time, but also Nicholas Volpe, the current chair, has continued the growth of the department. And we have satellites, and we have 200,000 visits a year in the department. So we've really grown a tremendous amount.
That's really incredible. I think about this because a lot of young retina specialists today move jobs quite a bit from institution to practice or, et cetera. The statistic I think that's out there is that half of people finding a new job in the retina space today will switch positions within the first 5 years. And you've really sort of defied those odds by being at Northwestern now for decades. But you also, as you alluded to, played an integral role in shaping the department. You served as chair for almost 30 years. What was it like leading the department? Tell us a little bit more about that period of time and what have been the most pivotal moments of your time there so far?
So Northwestern Memorial Hospital was always a very prestigious hospital, but it was really private practice. And the dean that recruited me had decided to convert it to a real academic medical center. And so one by one, as the chairs were replaced, they were replaced by academic people. And so I fit into that mold. And the hospital, which was a terrific place to take care of patients, became a research institution. And now, obviously, all the departments are purely academic.
Lee, one of your professional interests is clinical trials, and you've been deeply involved with some of the most major hallmark studies in our field, like MPS, Macular Photocoagulation Study, the Submacular Surgery Trials, Beaver Dam Eye Study, and the SCORE studies. Tell us how you first got involved with clinical trials, and what do you enjoy about your work in this area?
So my early years, after 1983 or so, I was interested in white spot, white dot syndromes, and I really was having a great career in that area, and I love that area. Stuart Fine, though, one of my friends, invited me to go on the data monitoring committee of the Macular Photocoagulation Study, and he invited me to Baltimore. He was running the study. He invited me to Baltimore. I stayed in his house, and they convinced me to join the data monitoring committee. And I loved every moment of data monitoring, and I did it for many, many years. I was on many committees, and there's a real challenge of doing data monitoring in terms of keeping the study running properly and giving them ideas, and yet you don't have to do the day-to-day mechanics of the study. So it was immediately apparent to me that data monitoring was very important to me.
You also met some pivotal players in the research space like Maureen Maguire and Barbara Hawkins. Tell us about those relationships and how you helped yourself grow. And it's very collaborative, the way we work and we grow from each other.
So the first data monitoring committee was run by Kurt Meinert, who was a giant in the field of clinical trials. And he taught me, every meeting we had, he taught me clinical trials. I never took formal training. I never took a course in clinical trials, but he really taught it and he drew it out. In fact, when he stepped down, he sort of offered me to continue as the head of some of the studies. So I learned, and then I had Barbara Hawkins and I had Maureen Maguire with me, and of course Stuart Fine was still around. So that was great experience in getting prepared for the career in clinical trials.
Incredible. And of course, when we're talking about clinical trials, we have to talk about the DRCR Retina Network, which was known as DRCR.net at that time. You've been involved with the DRCR since its inception, and you served as the chair from 2012 to 2017. Tell us about the network. What do you feel have been the most impactful studies coming out of this collaborative research group and in your experiences with this wonderful organization?
So first, let me tell you how I got involved with DRCR. So I decided that I was going to step down as chair after many, many years, and I had this void in my schedule. And Roy Beck, who founded DRCR, calls me up and he says, "How would you like to be the next chair?" And so I said to myself, "Why do I want to do that? I'm so happy with the white spots." So I actually talked to Mort Goldberg, and Mort said to me, "You need to take this job. It will you remain important for the rest of your career if you do that." And fortunately, his advice was good, and I went ahead and did it. And so I was involved with DRCR as chair for 5 years, and that was a great experience. And then since then, I've been chair emeritus and still working with the leadership of the organization. It's a wonderful organization with really brilliant people at the top from the very beginning of its time. And the list of people is too long to go through it now. But you all know who those people are, and they led very important studies. And then when I took over as chair, we did some of the most important studies, including particularly Protocol T. And that was a wonderful chance. We published it in the New England Journal of Medicine. And we changed the way diabetic macular edema was treated throughout the world. And that's the story of DRCR. The studies we've done have changed things. It's not very often that things change fast in medicine. Usually it takes 10 years, 20 years. But these studies changed within a couple of years.
Apart from your research, Lee, you've contributed to the field in several other ways, including leading multiple organizations, as past president of the AOS, trustee and VP of ARVO, and then president of Chicago Ophthalmologic Society. Did you enjoy these experiences? And tell us a little bit more about your motivations for staying involved in the community in this particular aspect.
So when I first went into ophthalmology, uh, th- all of the organizations were run by a group of about 7 people. People don't know that. The AOS, the ARVO,
Yep.
the Academy, right down the line, the same people would get together and run all the organizations. Well, that obviously changed, and I decided you had to choose which ones you wanted to do. You couldn't do all of them anymore. So I decided the ones I really loved were ARVO, and I got very involved with ARVO leadership, and also AOS, and I got very involved with AOS. And the AOS was a very stodgy old organization with very elderly leadership, and I felt strongly that they needed to have youth, they needed to have women, they needed to have international members. And so I pushed for that with the board of the organization, and they took the challenge, and then I rose to the leadership of the AOS.
Lee, you were very deservingly a past recipient of the ASRS Crystal Apple Award in recognition for the countless folks that you've mentored over your career. And I imagine, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I imagine that one of the main motivating factors for staying in an academic environment is the fact that you get to continuously teach, influence, shape our next generation of ophthalmologists and retina specialists. Is that an accurate assumption? And what do
So,
you enjoy
so
about that?
here's the amazing thing. When I was a resident and even going up through my career as chair, I did teaching, but I didn't have a passion for teaching. Since I stepped down as chair, I have an incredible passion for teaching, and it's the thing I enjoy the most right now. Working with the fellows, working with the residents, teaching in international scene. I've worked a lot in Milan, I've worked a lot in Rome, I've worked in Vienna, and I love teaching now, and it probably brings me more satisfaction than anything else that I do.
Well, we're on the subject of ASRS. You've been involved with the ASRS for decades now, and you've had the chance to see the organization evolve into its current form. Tell us about that and what that has been like to witness the organization change and grow, and what keeps you engaged and active with the American Society of Retina Specialists.
So we had an interesting evolution. So we had the Retina Society, and you couldn't get into the Retina Society, particularly if you're interested in medical retina like I was. Then we had the Macular Society, which is an incredible organization, and that grew in size. And then you had the need for another organization for the rest of people to continue their education and to exchange information and publish articles, etc. So I think it's very important that it exists, and I like it because it's so big that there's a lot of people out there that are very hungry to be educated, that it involves international people a tremendous amount, and those people don't have any place to go in the United States to try to keep up in their field. So you have the opportunity to influence these groups that don't exist otherwise in our sphere.
Lee, you've done tremendous work in the area of diabetic retinopathy, but one thing that intrigues me is that there's still so much that we don't fully understand about the condition and how it ends up leading to vision loss and some of the complaints that our patients come with to see us for every single day. You've explored this. What are your thoughts on the proposed mechanisms for vision loss when it comes to diabetic retinopathy?
So here's how far we've come. When I was a resident, we had no idea that diabetic retinopathy was, in essence, an inflammatory disease. This was a shock, and that steroids might be of benefit, that inflammatory cytokines like VEGF might be important, etc. So that's been explored and has led to big advances in the treatment. The Protocol T showed us the benefit of aflibercept in treating diabetic macular edema, and at the same time, we've done studies through DRCR of treatment of proliferative diabetic retinopathy with anti-VEGF also. And again, that study has changed the way proliferative retinopathies, both diabetic and others, have been treated throughout the world.
Lee, with all that you have on your plate, I imagine that it's been challenging at times to balance your work life with your life and everything outside of the workplace. And yet you've done so incredibly much in your life outside of work as well. You're an incredible athlete. I know you've run 27 marathons and have a passion for races and running. You also have a wife and 2 children. Tell us a little bit about how that's been balancing all of this over your career and lifetime.
Well, I'm a strong believer in physical fitness, and it keeps your mind and body alert. And I think that's why I feel so alert at this point, is that I'm very, very fit.
Lee, you have a funny story about how you met your wife. It was actually doing what both of you are very passionate about on the running trail. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Irma was the best woman runner in Chicago for many years, and she ran the Detroit Marathon twice. She came in first and second. She also founded the Chicago Marathon and the Chicago Area Runners Association. So I knew who she was, but she didn't know me. And she was up there running the races and things, and she would start the race, and then she would jump down and she would start running in the race. And I used to try to keep up with her because she was so fast. And at the beginning, I couldn't keep up with her, but gradually, as I got faster, I could keep up with her. So running together was an important part of my courtship.
Before we wrap up, I want to ask you 5 rapid fire questions. I call this segment Quick Questions with Christina. So tell us the first thing that comes to mind, 30 seconds or less. We'll start with the first question here. What's the greatest discovery in retina?
In our lifetime, I think probably vitrectomy it's changed the course of so many patients.
Most influential role model?
I would have to say Don Gass was, and he was a professor at the University of Miami. He described probably 50 different physical findings and diseases in the course of his life. He was a great observer. He didn't have the fancy imaging we have now. He had a ruby lens to look at the retina, which I couldn't see anything through the ruby lens. And he described all these wonderful findings in the eye. And every time we went to a conference, he was there to teach us. So we learned something from him all the time. So he was a tremendous role model. The second person is Paul Henkind. Paul Henkind was the chairman at Montefiore in New York, and he also was the leader of ARVO for many years. And he had a very incisive mind, and he was very demanding in the conferences that the speakers are accurate and that the questionnaires are accurate. And he would frequently make comments that would change the conversation because he was pointing out that things weren't going in the right direction. And he was the editor of, he converted the archives of the American Academy to the journal Ophthalmology. That was his doing, and he was an important editor at that journal. So he had such a great, sharp mind. He was very critical, which I sometimes am. And so he was one of my role models also.
Career accomplishment that's given you the greatest sense of satisfaction.
Okay, so this is an interesting story. When I was a resident, I was still a laboratory researcher and physiologist, and I got interested in prostaglandins. I heard a lecture on prostaglandins, and it had just been discovered that aspirin worked by affecting prostaglandins. So we decided to do research, Art Neufeld and Marvin Sears and I, on rabbits, and we found that prostaglandins were very important in inflammation in the eye. We published that in Nature quite a few years ago, but that's probably the most important publication that I've ever had. And for many years, it was very, very widely quoted. Now it's the fourth generation of the topic, so we don't get quoted. But I'm very proud of that discovery.
Favorite thing outside of work?
Athletics, I think.
And describe yourself in one word, Lee.
Intense. How about that?
I think that's very befitting. Lee, one of my favorite parts of our field is how much scientific advancement there's been over a relatively short amount of time. What excites you most about the future of our field?
Well, we've seen the advantage of gene therapy for RPE65, and there's going to be an expansion of genetic therapies for hereditary eye diseases. That's a field that's going to change a lot over the next few decades. In addition, we're going to understand mechanisms at the individual cellular level, both genetic and otherwise, that we can influence with medications or other treatments. And so I think we're going to be dealing with human retinal diseases on the cellular level in years to come. I got interested in genetics when I was a resident, and a friend of mine's wife was blind in one eye and very poor vision in the other eye, and they could not make a diagnosis on her. So when I got to Illinois as a fellow, we had Jerry Fishman there, who was one of the best ophthalmic geneticists. And I asked him to look at the patient, and we worked the patient up, and we made a diagnosis of what we call Favre-Goldman retinoschisis, which is a very rare hereditary disease. And we brought her family in from all over the country, and that contributed to the understanding of that disease. I've also been very much involved with optic nerve congenital abnormalities, which are hereditary. We have a huge family in the Midwest that's autosomal dominant, and we've brought those people in from all over the Midwest, and working with the University of Iowa, we've identified the gene abnormality in that condition. And we think that that's going to help us actually with glaucoma, because their optic nerves cup out just like low-tension glaucoma. So genetics are a really crucial part of our armamentarium right now.
Well, Lee, it's such an honor to learn about your illustrious career and hear it through your own eyes and hear your stories. And we really appreciate all you've done to move the needle forward in our field, and appreciate the time you took today to speak with us at ASRS Leaders and Legends.
Thank you, Christina. This was really fun. Thank you.